You know what is interesting about people who cannot be manipulated? They rarely look like what you would imagine. Most people picture someone impossible to manipulate as guarded, suspicious, scanning every interaction for hidden motives, treating everyone around them as a potential threat. But psychological research tells a very different story. Many of the behaviors most consistently observed in people who resist manipulation do not look like vigilance at all. Some of them look like the opposite. What social psychologists have discovered after decades of studying influence, persuasion, and resistance to it is that imperviousness to manipulation does not come from distrust. It comes from something far quieter. And that difference shows up in very specific, very recognizable ways. Here are 11 psychological traits that research consistently identifies in people who cannot be manipulated. Sign 1. They take their time before deciding anything. The first trait is a refusal to be rushed. Manipulation almost always relies on urgency. Act now. Limited offer. You need to decide before you miss out. People who are hard to manipulate have an almost physical resistance to that kind of pressure. Not because they have studied manipulation tactics, but because their decision-making process simply does not speed up on command. Researchers who study compliance techniques have found that artificial time pressure is one of the most reliable tools for short-circuiting critical thinking. For most people, urgency narrows attention and increases the likelihood of giving in. For people who are hard to manipulate, urgency produces the opposite effect. It triggers a kind of internal slowdown. The harder someone pushes them to decide quickly, the more deliberately they pull back. This is not stubbornness. It is a learned response that protects them from a tactic most people never even notice. Just before we continue, my name is Jaina, and we just launched this channel for people passionate about psychology and human behavior, just like you. The goal is to understand the hidden mechanisms behind people, emotions, and social interactions. If you want to help us keep going and improve the videos, think about subscribing. It's free and it makes a huge difference for us. Okay, let's continue. Sign 2. Their sense of self does not depend on your approval. The second trait is a stable inner sense of their own worth. Manipulation often works by making someone feel that their value, their relationship, or their identity is on the line. Withdraw affection. Hint at disappointment. Suggests that a disagreement means something is wrong with them. People who cannot be manipulated this way have what psychologists call low approval dependency. Research on attachment and self-concept has shown that individuals with a stable sense of personal worth show significantly smaller behavioral changes in response to social disapproval compared to those whose self-esteem depends heavily on external validation. In plain terms, when someone tries to make them feel bad to push them into compliance, the emotional hook does not catch. Not because they do not care about the relationship, but because their sense of well-being does not run on it. Sign 3. They notice the gap between words and tone before they notice the words themselves. The third trait is a heightened sensitivity to incongruence. People who are hard to manipulate pay close attention to how something is said before processing what is said. A compliment delivered with a slight smirk, a request wrapped in excessive warmth, an apology that does not quite match the face delivering it. Most people take the words at face value. People who resist manipulation register the mismatch first, often before they can even explain why something feels off. Research on nonverbal communication has shown that human beings transmit far more information through tone, pace, and microexpressions than through words, and that this channel is processed largely outside of conscious awareness. For most people, this information gets overridden by the literal content of what is said. For people who are hard to manipulate, the nonverbal signal often wins. They may not be able to articulate exactly what seemed wrong, but they trust that feeling enough to slow down and look more carefully. Sign 4. They ask questions instead of reacting. The fourth trait is a natural inclination toward curiosity rather than reaction. Manipulation tends to rely on triggering an immediate emotional response, defensiveness, guilt, excitement, fear, because reactions bypass reasoning. People who are hard to manipulate have a deeply ingrained habit of inserting a question between the trigger and the response. What exactly do you mean by that? Can you walk me through how you reached that conclusion? What would happen if I said no? This is not a technique learned from a book or a workshop, though it can be taught. For many of these people, it developed through lived experience, where reacting too quickly had cost them something. Psychologists who study decision making under social pressure have found that simply pausing to ask a clarifying question disrupts the emotional momentum that manipulation depends on. The person applying pressure is often counting on a reaction. A genuine question asked without hostility shifts the focus to what is actually being said, and the manipulation loses its footing. Sign 5, they are comfortable with disappointing someone. The fifth trait is a tolerance for disapproval. One of the most common manipulation tactics involves using someone's discomfort with conflict against them. If you really cared about me, you would not say no. Now you have hurt me. People who cannot be manipulated this way have accepted, often through hard experience, that someone can be disappointed in them, and that does not automatically mean they did something wrong. Research on compliance behavior has consistently linked a strong aversion to conflict with increased susceptibility to manipulation, because the manipulator only needs to create discomfort, not a valid argument, to get compliance. For people who are hard to manipulate, someone else's displeasure is information, not an instruction. They can sit with another person's frustration without feeling compelled to resolve it immediately by giving in. Sign 6. They remember what someone did, not just what they said. The sixth trait is a strong reliance on behavioral patterns rather than verbal promises. People who are hard to manipulate tend to place far more weight on actions than on words, especially over time. Someone can say the right things in the moment, apologize convincingly, promise change persuasively, but if the behavior does not change, the words stop registering as meaningful. Psychologists who study trust formation have found that most people are disproportionately influenced by recent verbal communication, what was just said, while underweighting long-term behavioral history. This makes repeated broken promises surprisingly effective as a manipulation tool, because each new promise tends to reset the emotional slate. People who resist manipulation do not reset the slate. Their internal tracking system runs on a longer timeline, and one charming conversation does not erase months of contradictory behavior. Sign 7, they can hold two opposing views about someone at the same time without it bothering them. The seventh trait is comfort with ambivalence. Manipulation often relies on all or nothing framing of people and relationships. This person is either good or bad, trustworthy or not, ally or enemy. People who are hard to manipulate remarkably comfortable with a more complex picture. Someone can be broadly well-intentioned and wrong about something specific. Someone can care about them and ask something unreasonable of them. Cognitive psychology researchers call this tolerance for ambiguity, and it has been linked to lower susceptibility to black and white persuasion tactics. When a manipulator tries to force someone into an extreme framing, this person did this terrible thing, therefore everything they have ever said or done is worthless. People with high tolerance for ambiguity simply do not make that leap. The nuance stays intact, and the manipulation, which depends on erasing nuance, loses its grip. Sign 8, they do not need to win the conversation. A common manipulation tactic involves convincing someone that walking away from a disagreement or simply not responding to it means they have lost or admitted fault. People who are hard to manipulate are remarkably indifferent to that framing. They can leave a conversation unresolved, leave a comment unanswered, or simply say, "I will think about it," without experiencing that as a defeat. Research on persuasion has shown that needing to have the last word or immediately countering an argument is one of the most effective ways to push someone toward a position they would not otherwise have taken. For people who resist manipulation, silence is not a defeat. It is simply silence. This trait alone removes an enormous amount of leverage from anyone trying to convince them of something through argument. Sign 9, they separate the message from the messenger. The 9th trait is the ability to evaluate information independently of the emotional state of the person delivering it. People who are hard to manipulate can hear someone make a request while appearing hurt, raising their voice, or even crying, and still assess the actual content of the request for what it is. The emotional delivery and the substance of what is being asked are processed as two separate channels. Psychologists who study emotional contagion have found that strong displays of emotion, particularly anger or distress, are highly effective at short-circuiting other people's independent judgment, essentially borrowing the urgency of the emotion to push through a request that would not have been accepted otherwise. People who resist manipulation can recognize that someone is upset, take it seriously, and still ask independently, is this request on its own terms reasonable? Those two questions do not collapse into one. Sign 10. They expect to feel slightly uncomfortable when they say no. The 10th trait is the acceptance of discomfort as part of the process. Many people interpret the discomfort of disappointing someone as proof that they are doing something wrong, and manipulators rely heavily on that misreading. People who are hard to manipulate have recalibrated what that discomfort actually means. They anticipate it. They have felt it many times, and they have learned that it fades, while the resentment of not having held a boundary tends to last far longer. Research on assertiveness training has shown that one of the biggest obstacles to resisting pressure is not a lack of awareness that something is wrong. It is the belief that the discomfort itself is proof of wrongdoing. People who resist manipulation have effectively separated those two things. The discomfort is real. It is simply not a verdict. Sign 11, they trust their own read of a situation even when they cannot fully explain it. And the 11th trait is the one that ties all the others together. People who cannot be manipulated have learned, often slowly through real experience, to take their own perception seriously even when it cannot be immediately proven. The feeling that something is off, even when everything looks fine on paper. A hesitation they cannot quite explain. The sense that a story has shifted slightly since the last time they heard it. This is not paranoia, and it is not infallibility. Sometimes their read is wrong, and they are capable of revising it, but they do not dismiss it simply because it is inconvenient or because someone else confidently tells them they are overreacting. Psychologists who study intuition and expertise have found that accumulated experience often produces accurate pattern recognition well before it produces a conscious explanation for that recognition. For people who resist manipulation, the feeling that something is wrong functions as legitimate data, something worth pausing on, even when the explanation has not yet caught up with the feeling. What is striking about these 11 traits is how often they are misread. The person who will not be rushed looks stubborn. The one who is comfortable with disapproval looks cold. The one who needs time to decide looks indecisive. The one who trusts their instincts looks irrational. But sometimes what looks like a collection of small friction points is actually something very precise, a mind that has simply stopped operating according to the assumptions that most attempts at influence depend on. At its core, being impossible to manipulate does not mean being closed off, suspicious, or constantly on guard. It means having a grounded sense of self, a relationship with time, and a relationship with discomfort that simply do not bend the way most pressure expects them to. And that, more than any specific tactic or technique, is what makes someone genuinely hard to manipulate. If this video described who you are today, leave a comment with the trait that felt most accurate. I read all of them, and if it put words to something you have been carrying quietly for a long time, share it with someone who needs to hear it. I am Think Within Officials. Do not forget to subscribe so you do not miss the next video. Goodbye.